is this House believes that it is in the interest of the United States to give half the island to the Soviet Union. We'll first go pronoun round. Given there's such a large audience, let's just do it outside if that's okay with the teams. Sorry.
Inherently, it's a funny idea. The spectator value goes to comments. You get more viewership than growing content.
Don't stop there, dude. Don't get it off. We're going to betting mark.
I chose
Is Anna earlier? We should have like a mid-rank or like campsite or like debates.
Oh, that's fair.
Eyes on you, Brandon.
Give the knobs an incentive to make it fun.
Innovation.
Yeah, it's a back specific approach. That's very fun. You want to keep betting the
Alright, thanks everyone. We'll get started now. The motion is this House believes that it's in the interest of the United States to give half the island to the Soviet Union. I'll begin by introducing the Prime Minister. David Wu is a multi-time Australasian finalist. I welcome him to begin the case for opening government. Yeah, look, I won't turn this off.
Aroon, you know all our secrets.
How do I turn this off?
Somebody may be offended.
Yeah, what's up? This off.
Oh, I don't have my phone.
That won't be sufficient.
Yeah, that was ominous.
Hey, Mikey, while you're up there, can you release the motion on the site? I would, my phone's down there.
Where's your...
My phone's here.
Oh, great, we'll do it on later phone.
Final or partial final?
No, shut up.
Wait, sorry, give me 1 second.
Okay.
Go.
Good?
Yeah.
Done.
You might find it a bit unintuitive. Why would you give up this island and give up half of it to the Soviet Union? Just by the way, we're going to call this island the Nook Island because it's like a burger, habitable and fertile. But the question of why we would give up this island, you need to interrogate what the US actually cares about in this race of supremacy in the context of the 1960s. It doesn't actually care that much about the economic resources that are bestowed from half its island, because America already has a very large GDP, and that is vastly larger than the Soviet Union. They already have a lot of economic resources. And in terms of other factors in which this Cold War is decided, military might and the space race is not one that America is necessarily going to out-trump the Soviet Union in, because the Soviet Union does have the power of centralization and can look better in those kind of grand projects. The thing that led to the defeat of the Soviet Union at the end of the day was, and this is the tipping point analysis, was how people and nations perceived the systems of capitalism and communism and how they manifested in the ways of like people's lives and how people were governed. And that is a process that we support the acceleration of by having this island, giving it half to the Soviet Union and demonstrating why capitalism is far superior to that of communism. Firstly, in terms of setup, what are the interests of the USA? Obviously, they want to spread the ideology of capitalism, but secondly, they see the Soviet Union as an existential threat to them, and they kind of want to outcompete the Soviet Union. And I guess what this model, or not model, but like what this kind of debate looks like, is that you would give them half the island and both countries would set up colonies on this island. But secondly, you would probably have a relatively open island where people can cross over and all that kind of stuff. So, given this, there are two arguments in this speech. Firstly, why we get the spread of US ideology, and secondly, why we precipitate the collapse of the Soviet Union. Firstly, on how we spread US ideology. What is the ideology that the US cares about? The US cares about the spread of capitalism. Firstly, because it is the idea that the US people genuinely believe in as a system. Secondly, because the counterfactual and the most understood counterfactual at the time is communism, which is an existential threat to the existence of the USA. And thirdly, it is economically beneficial because by getting more countries to be capitalists, they inflate the US dollar and they get trading partners and all that kind of stuff. So importantly, they want to spread capitalism and they want to show to the world that a capitalist system is a system where people are free, people are successful, and people are happy. The first thing I'm going to prove is why the US part of this island will succeed and the Soviet Union part of this island will absolutely fail. Firstly, the US part of this island will be likely successful because the US has a large population, which it can migrate workers and all that kind of stuff, has a lot of large multinational corporations that can go in and invest and build infrastructure, and it is specifically good at building nations. And on its CV, it has built Japan from the ground up and has built parts of Germany from the ground up. And those kind of technical skills aren't to be underestimated, right? Like, the building of nations is something that varies in quality between different countries, and the US is good at building that because the US understands that to build a nation, you need a rigid judicial system and you had good democratic functions, and that's the kind of thing that was copied in Japan and why those countries were good at being set up. Contrast that to the Soviets, who not only are in significant need of committing to this, but are a country that obviously has a far lower GDP than the US, have a system of communism which doesn't have the same kind of market incentives, and it doesn't have the system of, for example, innovation and creative destruction that is incentivized in the US. If you're somebody with a creative idea in the US, you are far less fearful of filing a patent because you know that that is something that can earn money, while in the Soviet Union, you are scared of saying anything in dissent because that is something that might get you executed or sent to the gulags. But the autocratic system of the Soviet Union was also bad because it wasn't good at motivating people. It spread a lot of corruption in which it was very difficult to track progress, or that progress would be diluted. But they also created systems that made it very difficult for that progress to be achieved. For example, people would lie about certain things that are happening in their community to make sure that they fit the quota, or they would lie about how large the kinds of things they were producing in order to meet the quota, and that caused systems of collapse all the way down that chain. So what that means is that US part of the island is likely to be far, far more successful than the Soviet Union part of the island, and the Soviet Union, importantly, is kind of doomed to fail in this aspect because they want to show that communism is really good and strong, so they're kind of destined to do these kind of failing things. Now let's secondly talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll take a point from closing.
If this island is so symbolic of communism versus capitalism, why doesn't the USSR just poison your crops?
The USSR just poisoned your crops. Well, obviously, if you discovered that that poison was from the USSR, you could expose them and say that they're evil. But also, this seems to be an apt strategy that you could adopt in any part of the world. For example, you could adopt it in in the South Korea part of Korea or the South Vietnam part of Vietnam. But the reason why they don't do it is because countries don't want to just stab the other countries in the back. They want to show other countries that they are legitimately a better system, and that only the legitimacy of their system is what convinces countries to join. So, about the collapse of the Soviet Union, two axes to this argument: one, economics, second, ideological. The first thing to say is that this would be a very significant expense for the Soviet Union, that, like, you know, they're already spending a lot of money on things like on the space race, on their budget on centralization, and all that kind of stuff, and this just expands that race and accelerates the progress of that race. Notably, the Soviet Union has a set of really important economic problems because, you know, you have to divert a lot of money from your domestic attention, but also divert money from the fragile blocks under which that Soviet Union is based on. And that means that you have less money to spend on things like domestic consumption and imports and all that kind of stuff. Ideologically, it is important to convince other countries to adopt your kind of way of living. And the Soviet Union kind of already does this on a small scale with like Potemkin villages and like displaying that they have like good economic progress and all that kind of stuff. But given the attention on this island and how like large this island is, will be very noticeable that the US system is better. But the other really important thing and why this island is unique in its benefit is because the reason why the Soviet Union could say that a lot of the countries that it went into, such as North Korea, failed, is because they are developing countries with different cultures that necessarily had a system that would fail even if they had communism. That is different to this island because the US and the Soviet Union have to directly go into a blank slate and demonstrate how the systems from start to finish are able to be successful or not. And that is a hurdle that the Soviet Union will very likely fail. Lastly, in terms of diplomatic advantage, I think you just look very generous if you give half the burger away, or half the McIsland away. You also look like you have good faith, which helps in dialogue and peace and all that kind of stuff, which means you ease tensions to a significant extent. The end of the Soviet Union was a great thing for people's fears and for the way that the world was shaped. We accelerate that by like 20, 30 years. That is why we win this debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now welcome a multi-time Easter's bubble room maker and one-time Easter's quarterfinalist, Mikey Taronga Zoo.
Two observations lose opening government this debate. First is that their policy is absolutely no different to the status quo. If you think about Earth as an island, which it is, of a bundle of different planets that exist within the universe, this experiment has already happened. The Soviet Union exists on a separate plane in competition to the United States, and the way that that has played out has already led to the exact same terrible situation that is in the status quo that this policy attempts to get out of. There is no fundamental difference in the results that they are able to claim under their side to what is already occurring in the status quo. The second observation to make is that none of that opening government case at all deals with the fact of how the Soviet Union will react to this policy. Closing opposition sort of poke at it, very helpfully for them, in an example of how Russia will probably, or Soviet Union is likely to undermine this new form of island. But really importantly and obviously, opening government give no proof to suggest why the Soviet Union will be entirely cooperative in the way in which opening government assume they would be under their particular policy. So we're going to tell you in very simple reasons. Firstly, why this is absolutely unbelievably bad for the United States' interest in immediate safety, especially in a military context, and then 6 extraneous harms as to what their policy will probably bring about. Firstly, why would the Soviet Union immediately install military and nuclear weapons on the island? 3 mechanisms. One is obvious, which is that in the midst of a Cold War in which there is a particularly high level of tension, where both countries are engaging in literally nuclear learning and training skills every single day, it is totally unclear why this island will be miraculously in a vacuum in which none of this context is taking place. Secondly, you are now putting them in close proximity, which increases the risk factor this has. It's a lot easier in terms of misunderstandings that would occur between the two nations, in terms of the fact that they would likely, in a very close proximity, come into direct conflict on an individual versus individual level, whereas when you're separated across 2 different countries, it's a lot less likely that this occur. Thirdly, you're giving Russia an incredibly strategic placement. The Pacific Ocean is on the west of the United States and on the east of Russia. Any basic geography tells you the east of Russia is an incredibly poor and undensely populated part of Russia, and the west of the United States is incredibly densely populated. So you're whacking the military of Russia in closest to the most densely populated part of the United States, while giving the United States no such benefit over Russia. An unstrategic placement. The impact of this is threefold. Firstly, that obviously the misunderstandings are likely to lead to a huge level of catastrophe and a huge level of harm. It's literally the Cuban Missile Crisis being giving another chance to go really wrong, which obviously is incredibly bad under their case. Second, you increase the amount of likelihood for defections and things like disloyalty to occur, because when you've got individual soldiers in close proximity to Russian ones, you're very likely to have things like defections that existed already when you were cross-country and cross-ocean borders. Now you're putting them together in the same island. A lot of United States intelligence is likely to lose. The other mechanism for this is that the morale would be terrible. Imagine drawing the short straw and being the soldier who's on the island, who's right next to Russian soldiers. What an incredible incentive for you to run across to the other side. And that means, thirdly, the real risk is that Russia will end up with the entire island, and if they don't do so outwardly, or in terms of what the world acknowledges, they'll do so inwardly. Secretly, they'll end up with the whole of the island because they have the ability to infiltrate into the United States in a way that's particularly bad. Notice that the United States doesn't have the symmetric ability to do that, because the United States were the ones who concede this particular part of the island to Russia in a way that was particularly harmful for any sort of principal benefit under their side of the house. So let's now move on to the 6 extraneous reasons why this is a bad idea. Firstly, just want to point out, incredibly unprecedented and weird concession to make. Like, why are you doing this? This is your land. You found it as the United States. It makes the United States look incredibly weak in a context where they're already, by the way, losing the space race at this point until 1 year later where they miraculously win it. They are losing the space race up to this point. And now not only are you losing the space race, but magically, you've now given away half your island in the context of even little political dimensions of power are giving each country the edge. You've just given them a huge one that they can vocally proclaim on the media, which is in the information slide. That means there's a likelihood for a high level of anxiety within the United States, within the world, in terms of their faith towards the United States and the fact that they are likely to win, which is bad for all democratic countries, as well as the American people, who now live in fear every single fucking day that they're probably on the edge of losing, which is why the United States have miraculously made this concession. And thirdly, it just increases Russia's interest. Like, David can go on all he likes about how powerful the US GDP is, but when someone is down, you don't just fucking let them come back up again by giving them half the island. You keep them down, you keep punching them down, you keep saying, we get this whole island, and it's much closer to you. It's a much better way of going about it. Secondly, the clear idea that, you know, if you planned the moon landing and you think you're going to win that, why would you undermine the ability for you to claim that win by immediately 1 year beforehand giving pieces of land away to Russia? Like, seems like an excellent way to mitigate a lot of the benefits you're likely to have here. And thirdly, giving like a trade route within the Pacific to Russia is incredibly insane. This is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, one of the most important commerce trade routes in the world at that time, given planes were not very good at that point at carrying things like trade across the air. It's really important that ocean trade routes still remain. Fourthly, you've given them fertile land. One of Russia's biggest disadvantages is that they don't have a lot of very fertile land on their in their country, which is why a lot of Russians are starving, which is the reason for the GDP level of GDP decrease that they're trying to claim on their side. You're giving them fertile land, which is immediately a great way to up their GDP and allow their population to actually be fed in a way that's obviously incredibly bad for the United States. Before I go on, closing anything?
Yeah, what if we just tell the Russians on that side of the island to plant their seeds slightly too close together, and then all of these islands to happen in style?
Sorry, I have no idea what a POI is, but I'm sure you guys can explain it in the The fifth thing to say is that you give nukes that are likely to be planted a target place for the exact same mechanisms I explained earlier in the debate. Like, nukes at that point, the range is incredibly limited. You now give them an exact hunting place which is very close to the United States and very likely to harm them. 6, on this idea of a habitable country, which directly responds to opening government's case, the idea that this will show that capitalism is good is under the incredibly laughable, literally hurt people sniggering the crowd, assumption that capitalism will necessarily win in this particular island. The idea that the Soviets wouldn't come up with incredibly ingenious ways to undermine it, and that capitalism wouldn't be more successful in a world where they actually can rely on being quite far away from forces that undermine capitalism, that make it less successful in order for it to survive. If you had a list of solutions that you wanted to make capitalism and the United States look more powerful, giving them a concession of land when you were the one that found it seems like the absolute worst idea to sell to the media and sell to the population as a whole. What a terrible idea.
thank you very much for that speech. I now welcome the multi-time runner-up best speaker at both Easters and Australs, as well as Easters champion and Australs grand finalist, Udai Bot.
Doesn't work. Okay, that's fine. I'll just be loud. The United States of America made sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice purely in the interest of defeating the Soviet Union. If you think about all of the military expenditure that they engaged in, all of the diplomacy, all of the foreign aid that could have been piled into domestic consumption, service provision, or any other cause, it was a tremendous sacrifice of not just lives, but quality of life for every person who lived in the country. Which explains why this is by far the most important priority of the actor, and a lot of the stuff that side of opening opposition tells you just does not matter. The second observation I want to make is that the way that the US won the Cold War was by expanding the battlefield at every opportunity possible to exploit the fact that capitalism was a more efficient and more successful economic system than communism, and to exploit the fact that democracy was a far better political system than authoritarianism, that delivered better rights, that delivered better values, delivered more happiness and prosperity for its people. Which is exactly why they engaged in the space race, why Reagan started the Star Wars program explicitly to force the Soviets to spend more, why the US kept upping its military budget beyond the point where it was ever reasonable. We didn't need a 606 ship fleet under Reagan that was purely an idea designed to force the Soviets to spend more on their navy at the expense of other important parts of their economy, which is why they eventually collapsed. It's the reason why we started so many proxy conflicts, even when it was not necessary, to force them to be everywhere in the world at once, because we knew that their capacity to do all of those things was so much weaker. This is exactly what we've always done. We are widening the conflict in the biggest way possible to demonstrate the weaknesses of the Soviet system. It was unfortunate that opening opposition was both historically and geographically illiterate in their case. Let's go through what they tell you. Firstly, Mikey says, this is the status quo. The US and the Soviets already compete. One, we are expanding the scale of that competition, which favors us because we have the higher GDP, we have a bigger population, and we are more efficient. Secondly, obviously, this is different to those other instances, as David points out. One, because there is far more media attention on this. Two, because it's much harder to hide what's going on, because the Iron Curtain exists in Europe and prevents people accessing it. Other proxy conflicts occur outside of what is like the Western world, which people care about. This is a new, exciting island, which everyone will listen to and look at. Secondly, the fact that it's island means you can sail around and stuff and see what's happening. You can't hide it the way that the Soviets hid a lot of the suffering that occurred deep within the Soviet Union. There'd be far more eyeballs on what was occurring. There'd be far more visibility. Secondly, they say the Soviets would react in a way that would be bad. Firstly, they would put nukes and troops on the island. Excellent, right? That's exactly what we want. They would spend huge amounts of money and resources diverting troops to this fucking random island that we don't care about at the expense of their capacity to wage conflicts in areas we care about. Like, they're not going to be able to threaten Berlin very effectively if they have to divert tons of troops to McIsland instead. But secondly, it means that they're going to have to spend an even greater portion of their GDP on the military. Note, they're already spending like 4 to 5 times the percentage of their GDP the US was on their military, because their economy is so much smaller and because they were so much less efficient. This puts significantly more pressure on them. But thirdly, like, why is this a harm? They already share a ton of borders. For example, the entirety of Europe. For example, Alaska and the other part, and you know, the like Vladivostok and so on neighbor each other already. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis just occurred. Korea exists, the Vietnam War is going on. Like, why is adding another border a bad thing? Obviously, a hot war will not happen for the fact that mutually assured destruction already exists at this point in time. Both the Soviet Union and the US know they cannot engage in a hot war because it would result in the destruction of everything on Earth. And we know that because the Cuban Missile Crisis has occurred in 1962 at this point. We've seen Khrushchev back down to avoid mutually assured destruction. The US would be very secure in knowing that that would be okay. Finally, and really the most devastating harm for this team, is the reason that the Soviets backed down in the Cuban Missile Crisis was because now we had submarines that could launch nuclear missiles. So having nukes near the US is not a new thing anymore. They have submarines all over the world that could launch nuclear missiles at the US. The island isn't really any more useful. Then they say, well, this could allow for more defections. Again, good. Defections overwhelmingly favored the US. People weren't defecting from America to the Soviet Union. It was the other way. We were getting information. We were getting propaganda. We were getting all sorts of information about what was going on there that was incredibly useful to us in planning against the Soviets. But two, it sent a message to all the other countries that were watching on the world stage that people were fleeing the Soviet Union and coming to the land of freedom and burgers, which is exactly why that was good for us. If people wanted to defect the Soviet Union, yes, maybe this makes it a bit easier, but that is a favorable trade, and it's unclear why that was particularly harmful in our instance. Thirdly, they say Russia might take over the island. Well, firstly, it's unclear that they would have the capacity to do so. Secondly, we say they definitely don't have the incentive to start a hot conflict. Thirdly, if they claim is that they would do salami tactics or something, it's just unclear. Why didn't they do it in Berlin? That would be analogous. Demonstrate how that would occur. Obviously would not. They say they might poison the crops and salt the fields or something at CO. Again, it seems like that is something that could occur anywhere, right? There are lots of borders. They could do that kind of stuff in a lot of different places. The answer is one, it seems probably difficult to do and easy to detect. Two, the value of it seems relatively limited because you poison the fields, the US discovers, they take the poison out, they fix it. It seems like that would actually expend more resources than it would perhaps benefit, which would again be useful to us. But finally, we would just say, it seems unlikely that would risk escalating tensions in that instance, considering the fact that the US would probably also have troops there. It would probably also, risk starting a conflict, which we explained for reasons previously they would not want to do. Closing.
Your mortal enemy comes up to you and offers you half an island. How do you not realize that's a trap?
So I think the answer is maybe you do suspect it's a trap, but you're forced by the pressures we identified to do it anyway, right? Maybe the Soviets knew that Reagan's space, Star Wars was a trap, and there wasn't really going to be space lasers. But they still had to react because they'd be seen as weak. They'd be seen as stupid if they didn't react. But secondly, we think there are plausible explanations. For example, Khrushchev backing down the Cuban Missile Crisis was disproportionately harmful to the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the US. That's why Khrushchev lost his position of power. We could easily say that we were kind of paying them back for that, or we were taking a bit of a hit. But secondly, their response to why we concede, one, we just point to other instances where this has occurred, like the Antarctic Treaty or the Treaty on the Moon, both involved the US and Soviets sharing territory and agreeing to split things between them. And we could make it look as a diplomatic gesture to show that the US is magnanimous. They say this increases Russian resources and gives them trade routes and fertile land. One, they already have lots of resources. They're the largest exporter of wheat, Mikey. What the hell? That's why there's a commodity crisis at the moment, because of the Ukraine war. But thirdly, it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Ships are already there. Why do you need a trade route? Why is the island creating a trade route? Makes no sense. Finally, obviously, at the end of this debate, none of what they said was in any way unique. What you needed to know is that the way the US won against the Soviet Union was to expand the scale of conflict to demonstrate the superiority in the clearest way possible, which is why we are so proud to win.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now welcome ANU's finest.
Thank you.
Who is now, I reliably informed, more of a Sydney sider than a Canberrian, and whatever. I welcome Jordyn Vibe Control Gibson.
Sorry, Jordyn, I think my pen's there. Can you just swap up?
Oh.
Over the outside.
Alright. I like to think that Udai asking me to pass him his pens just then is kind of like a good example of this, right? This guy's sort of a good faith thing. He's asked a favor of me. He's like, oh, pass me my pens. But what he doesn't know is that I've already coated those pens with a toxic nerve agent. Udai cannot possibly win UNSWIV if he's busy convulsing and passing out in his chair. And that is exactly what happens in this type of situation as well, right? The US, these guys modeled in, they're like, no, we're gonna compete in really good faith. We don't have a competition of ideologies. Like, we're gonna set up a town and they'll set up a town and it'll kind of be like, a big city skylines type of town competition. And we'll see, whose citizens look healthier and well-fed and happier. But that is obviously not what is gonna happen here. And there's a few reasons why that is true. The first one is that, obviously, I think the easiest thing that the USSR would do in response to this is they'd be like, you idiots, like, you're just giving us half an island even though we already lost the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, the fuck were you thinking? Well, we're gonna really twist the knife now, because it's gonna be a massive gotcha moment when these guys are earnestly setting up their little town, and the Soviets have put nukes on the island, or they've put troops on the island, or they've built a big harbor base. And the thing that Mikey tells you is not geographically illiterate. We had a big fight about this at the bench, actually. We've all gotten our east and west confused. But the thing is, the Pacific Island, if you look at a map, so on the right-hand side of the Pacific is where, like, LA and stuff, the coast of the US. I'm going to avoid using east and west to avoid confusion. And on the other side of it is, like, Eastern Russia. And there's fuck all in Eastern Russia, right? Because, all of the big population centers are in the West. Like, in Western Europe, they're close to that. Please, I hope this is intuition pumping maps enough. But, like, Moscow and St. Petersburg are way over that way. So this island doesn't give the US any sort of valuable, like, nuclear range improvement. But, oh my god, now the Soviets have a base in a place that is very close to Hawaii and very close to the rest of, the US as well. And I think that at the point where you've already given them half an island, probably they think, next step, we take the whole island, step after that, Hawaii. And I think that that is where this goes from here. The important thing to understand here, though, is that a bunch of the mechanisms as to why you would lose this contest, even if we assume the Soviets engage in it in good faith, just don't make sense. They're like, oh, you have more GDP. But GDP is not the same as the amount of money that a government has at its disposal. And of course, they are just empirically incorrect about the population sizes thing, because the USSR, not Russia, the USSR, which includes a variety of countries, a very large number of them, had far more people than the US had, and of course has more capacity then to extract taxes from those people, which means that although its GDP was low, oh fuck, my phone just died. Although its GDP is low, that does not mean that it doesn't have more money in the government pot to spend on these things. Thank you so much. Which means that, oh fuck, which means of course that sure GDP might be lower, but that doesn't mean that the Soviets don't have more money or more rubles or whatever that they can throw at this problem. And they will of course do so in order to, if they do choose to engage in good faith, in order to win. Like, the amount of money that it takes to set up one extra town is probably not so big that it drags out this. You guys are doing the same thing, so it doesn't widen the gap. You just, there's just both sides are spending more money, so that's not very useful. But of course, there are a bunch of reasons why the Soviets are better at this. They're probably more motivated, they're humiliated by the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they just suddenly got this huge concession out of the US where inexplicably they were given half of Spain as like a gift. Probably means that the Soviets are like desperate to make up for that humiliation and highly motivated to capitalize on it. So they will probably suffer through worse circumstances at home and be happy to send more of their money to the island. Americans are selfish, evil creatures, as we all know, and will not do this. So I think that that is unreasonable. The final thing to say here, though, of course, is that capitalism probably just looks worse. Like, at the point where the Soviets can divert a lot of money, and they can explicitly do it because government interference and subsidies and funding is a very, communist act, whereas these guys can't really do that, because capitalism relies on freedom. It relies on not money being funneled into the island. The idea is that the inhabitants are supposed to start their own society and do really well off of it. That's very difficult to do, though. It's much easier to have a government from abroad that is supporting you quite directly and explicitly. Their island probably has people who are like, oh god, how do we build a plumbing system? How do we connect an electrical grid? Whereas the Soviet island has wonderful subsidies and bags of Ukrainian wheat that are being sent to them. They're doing pretty well over there, and they definitely don't have the things that these guys have. They don't have unemployment, they don't have homeless people. In the first year of these islands, the Soviets win massively, and maybe in 10 or 20 years they can kind of improve things somewhat through capitalism, but the immediate impact is the Soviets decimate you. And I think the worst possible outcome here is that this probably overshadows the moon race, which the Americans are about to win, and know they are about to win, because obviously a moon landing is something that takes decades of planning. They already know that they're going to do it. They've done tests, they know it's likely. The worst case scenario is that they risk this overshadowing that imminent cultural victory, and that means that then they are not able to get that kind of thing. So that's really, really bad. But again, of course, it's just going to be a gotcha moment. They're going to nuclearize the shit out of GIMMICK Island, and that's pretty bad. what happens then? Even if it's not nuclearized, there is a high risk of conflict between just civilians who hate each other. This happens in border conflicts all the time, so staying generous here. And that is a real problem for them. It is a really good thing that there were no shared land borders between American troops and Russian troops. The borders that they identify had other countries' troops in them and did not spark off that same risk of personal hatred leading to conflict. They didn't have the same problems and psychological impacts that they have to deal with, where the Soviets are embarrassed and want to make up for their past failures. The Americans are frightened and confused by their government's inexplicable concession and probably feeling particularly vulnerable to the Soviets next door. This is a disaster scenario, and of course, probably nobody wants to be on the island starting society from scratch. These soldiers are exhausted, they're stressed, they don't have plumbing, they want to die, right? And they're probably pretty willing to take down some Soviets with them when they do so. That seems pretty bad, and at the point where failure happens, that's disastrous for you. We'll take closing.
Is there really any left, right, east, and west on a globe, Jordyn?
Oh, come on, Kana. The Pacific Island is like this is it's in between the bad bit of Russia and the good bit of Are we happy now? So, final thing. Let's talk a little bit about conflicts here, because I think that's probably by far the most important thing to consider in this debate. These guys are like, no, the Cuban Missile Crisis already happened, so the Soviets won't try to fight back. But they don't understand the fact that this is an era of strongman diplomacy. It's an era of winning the hearts and minds of people and proving your ideology is the best one. Which is why the Soviets make the Americans look like total cuck idiots when they militarize McIsland and they attack like the villagers over there, or they terrify the villagers and the villagers defect out of fear, which is highly likely in this scenario. Or they they just build a better society, which is also highly likely for the reasons that I've told you about. The thing that you do need to understand, though, is that they have not proven a single harm to the US just keeping the island. They've done no attempt to do so, and I hope we get an attempt at closing. Which means at this point, we have a very certain thing. We take the island, which is normal and expected. There is no real retaliation, because nobody thinks it's a bad thing when you take an island that you found. It's probably just like winning the space race will be in a year, where the Soviets are kind of like, dang, we wish we'd gotten to it first, but we're not going to nuclear strike the US. By trying to live in harmony, you open up a risk of conflict, and that conflict could destroy millions of lives. Don't take the risk. Take the McIsland. It's awesome. Good idea.
Thank you very much for the opening half of the debate. I now welcome the next speaker in the debate, who is the member of government. Please welcome the Easter's grand finalist, Connor, opera singer, vegan, Catholic, monkey trainer, Leslie Keith.
By the way, Connor, just noticing it's been kind of left off our intros. Do you remember how good that women's grand final was last year?
Yeah, Michael Kirby watched that one, didn't he?
Yeah.
I forgot Mikey's world's ballroom as well, don't worry.
Yeah.
This fucking table, dude.
It is a wisdom so old that I do not even know where to attribute it to, that a house divided unto itself cannot stand. When we're talking about the kinds of threats that put islands in the middle of the Pacific the size of countries, at a time in human history where we absolutely would have found it if it were legit, we cannot afford to be the kind of divisiveness between the two global powers. whatever the fuck this thing is, we absolutely need to stand united to meet it. Firstly, let's talk about why the island is incredibly suspicious. Secondly, we'll talk about why we need to tell the Soviets about it in this instance. I'll note very briefly that this is not per se a knife of our opening. We just think it's more important to be a little more skeptical than the sheeple of the opening half. This island is the size of Spain, and it is the 1960s, and it is in the middle of the most inhabited of the most traversed ocean by freight by military expeditions in the world. No one has any questions about this. Allow us to be the first team to rub two brain cells together. Why is this island incredibly suspicious? This is absolutely not a real island in the, I guess, terrestrial sense. But because it could not have arrived by any natural means, it could not have been tectonic plate moving. That simply has occurred too quickly, and we probably would have felt something like that along Pacific fault lines if that were the case. It could not have been an asteroid because it is the size of Spain. That is like larger than the one that killed the dinosaurs. It would have killed us all. That is a mass extinction event. And no, we thirdly know that it has to be a landmass because things can grow in the soil on it. It's very fertile. So it could not be kind of like the ever-shifting sands of the Pacific in the shallows. It could not be a coral atoll that we somehow missed. Has to be an island, incredibly suspicious, don't know where it came from. Secondly, it has to have arrived somewhere, from somewhere, because there is no way that we could have missed it. One, it is the size of Spain. It is larger than any Pacific island that we have found already. And I would note that at this point in the 1960s, with the kind of demands that have been growing for nuclear testing, for all those things, we have found atolls that are like 2 meters wide. We have found those, we've identified them, we've claimed them. The United States has claimed them and has many of them at this point. There's unclear why they wouldn't have found this one. Secondly, we absolutely have the technological capacity to find it. We have planes that are conducting surveillance. We have sonar. We have satellites. And no, people have been in this area countless times. We note that the Pacific Rim is the fastest growing population area in the world. Everything at this point in time has to be shipped by freight. They're constantly crisscrossing the most inhabited part of the world across the most useful trade routes in the world. We note that Pacific Islanders didn't find it, despite migrating through this area for thousands and thousands of years. Fourthly, we note that military projects in the area for nuclear testing have been, on these various coral atolls, have been in the area for years at this point as well. We fifthly note that the Allied Axis island hopping campaign was only like 20 years ago, and there was a ton of activity in the area at this point in time. So, what could it be? We tell you it's either like a ship, or it's a terraformed landmass by some technology that we cannot even comprehend. I don't fucking know. It's probably aliens. And there's no way to know what it is. We should probably assume that it's aliens. Why should we assume that it's aliens? We firstly know that aliens exist, and I'm so fucking lame for UNSW IB final. Why am I the first person to talk about aliens? So lame, like lame points for all of you. Firstly, we know that aliens exist for 3 reasons. One, the conditions for life. I'm sorry for those of you who have heard this before. Are themselves abundant. That is like liquid water. It is carbon. Secondly, the substrates in which life can exist are themselves not finite. There could be silicone-based life, there could be gaseous life, could be all of those things. Thirdly, not hearing from anyone at this point doesn't really prove anything because communications by radio waves have only just gone out at this point in time. Secondly, even if none of you think it's aliens, we are debating from 1968, which means that the Roswell incident in New Mexico was less than a decade ago. Most people think that that was a military cover-up of alien activity in the United States at this point. UFO sightings, at this point, if you look at a graph, are an all-time high. There's a massive spike over the 60s. The military is investigating them constantly and covering them up from the public. So if you don't think this in all of your modern sensibilities, they absolutely do. They go, oh my god, they know that we know how to get to the moon and that we're about to get there. Now they are trying to fuck with us because they realize that we know how to get off of the planet in a real way. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so aliens from a different galaxy probably don't know much about Earth. God literally created the Earth.
Well, in the instance that it is God, I would say that we probably ought meet the second coming of Christ with the same unity, lest we all be smoked. Because the kind of God that moves oceans, I would note, is an Old Testament God, is one of fury, is not one that likes a lot of noise, and I would note that requires an enormous amount of noise. So you should probably stop doing that. In any case, I think this framing still wins us the debate. Secondly, why do we absolutely need to tell the Soviets in these instances? Obviously, it is impossible to know whether it is malicious or benevolent, because honestly, it could just be a super, cool, fertile gift. Like, here's some land for you to grow stuff, we're gonna have a peace summit here, we're gonna have a chat to you, all that kind of stuff. Secondly, equally, actually could be like a landing base and a point and a foothold for invasion, because like they can grow stuff there, they can build there, and they put it there for that purpose. No, we should probably assume the latter here, especially if we think that God exists, which means you probably believe in the Pascal wager in this instance, because like the harm of being completely unprepared for an alien invasion is obviously fucking awful. And also there's relatively little harm in assuming that it is for the invasion purposes, because there's really little harm to like hiding some nuclear subs around it that probably wouldn't provoke them very much. So let's talk about scenario 1, which is like just a really cool gift. Noting that accepting this gift and being the first country to accept this gift tips the power balance in a way that is likely to promote further Soviet-US conflict, that might be the thing. Like US plus aliens is probably the thing that tips the mutually assured destruction balance and puts that in the Soviets' corner and means that they finally hit the button. Especially in the context that we already hear, where they're likely to be goaded into it after like the last instance in which someone backed down was like catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Obviously, nuclear warfare horrible for everyone, terrible for God who likes his beauty rest. Secondly, scenario 2, it's really bad and it is maliciously intended. Firstly, there's the need for a united position to stop the Soviets defecting to the enemy and resorting to the tactic that is very commonly used in colonization, which is to elevate an enemy of the dominant global power. That happened in South America, happened now all throughout Africa, happened in this country. That is a tool of colonizers. If that's what the aliens are trying to do, you need to stop the Soviets from being their pawns by giving them 50% of the legal and logistical responsibility for protecting and owning the island, to force them to not work together at that point. But secondly, we need to not assume sole financial and logistical responsibility for funding and producing the defense at the front line against the aliens. That is the exact same logic as for anything that the Soviet Union needs to be goaded into spending money on, but also just from a logistical sense, the United States does not want to be hamstrung by the sole fiscal responsibility for defending against the worst threat that humanity has ever faced. Thirdly, we probably just do need their help. They have massive manufacturing capacity, lots of wheat, as I'm told. And fourthly, there's a revealed preference for this, albeit later on. 1985, at the Geneva Treaty was signed, said the United States and the Soviet Union would and should work together, even at the height of the Cold War at that time, in the event of an alien invasion, in the event that Earth is under threat. We prefer those protocols, even if this is not aliens, which it absolutely is, be in place now for being the coolest team thus far, and also proving that aliens exist and that this island is so suspicious. So proud to govern.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now welcome the member of opposition, Catherine, the real Slim Shady Cheng. Rap God.
Oh, rap God, alright, cool. Man, I don't even know why CG had to jump to the alien extension. There was still material left on the table. One response to it, which is to say, Ellie already explains why it is far likely to be a blessing from God than from aliens. If it is a blessing from God, and you give it to the USSR, who are, atheistic heathens who destroyed the church and destroyed all the priests in there during Stalinist purges, I think this probably is a very, very bad idea and something which God would be very angry about. The implication of this is that God will be mad and he can do many bad things. So he'll probably make Yellowstone explode and the USSR gets fucked. Seems like a bad idea. CG done. Next, I'm going to go with dunking on OG. 2 observations to just wipe out the case. Number 1 is they make a claim that you need this ideological state of origins in order to kind of see whether capitalism or communism exists. Number 1, I don't know why it has to be side by side. They already have CV items of Japan and Germany versus the USSR who gets North Korea. That seems kind of bad. Then it goes, well, the spotlight's here. It's just like an even greater competition. And the thing to note here is, yeah, maybe spotlight is great, but like Jordyn says, it might succeed, it might be a base island, but importantly, even if it was true, it would be incredibly marginal in the larger scale of things, and that benefit isn't that strong. Secondly, he claims, well, this precipitates the collapse of the USSR, and this claim is truly boggling, because number 1, even if it failed, the USSR probably won't tell its people that it failed. McIsland was still going to be faced. The problem here is that collapse does not just require external forces moving around. It required internal forces for people to recognize that communism was not the vision for a good life. Communism was failing them, and they could have a better life. It was the people who needed to dream of blue jeans, mappings, and freedom in order to want to tear down the Berlin Wall in order to gain their own freedom. That did not happen under their side. I guess that's it. So, onto our extension. And initially, I wanted to run a really base extension about why the island is going to be good and why, I don't know, espionage is awesome. But instead, it got taken. So here's the history extension of why, in this specific point of time, it is incredibly unstrategic for the USL to do so. I'm going to explain why this matters, so you don't go, why did Kat give us a history lesson about Brezhnev's regime? The reason here is that the information relevant to the US, which is to say, information about military spending, information about the economic situation, and information about Brezhnev's kind of policies, would indicate the USL was going to be fucked, which therefore meant it was incredibly unstrategic at this point in time to make this decision and give them context. Leonid Brezhnev was the leader. Characteristics of his regime. Number one, it was a shift away from Khrushchev's regime, which is say the key factors of that was that Khrushchev liberalized, he also distanced himself off away from Stalin. The problem here is the reason why he did this is A, because he wanted to create his own cult of personality, his own legacy to be remembered as a great Soviet leader. Secondly, legitimation of the Soviet Union is still heavily dependent on the success of Stalin and all the policies he had there, which is why he leant back on the old policies. What do these policies look like? Number one, I think these policies look a lot like renationalizing areas and recollectivizing areas and establishing things like regional economic zones, economic organizations and councils to oversee kind of production and oversee monitoring all the industrial work which is happening. Number two, it also looked like things like repression. And the reasons why repression occurred was A, at the point where there was some increased freedoms under Khrushchev and you roll it back, people are unhappy, which is why you need to double down and crack down on them afterwards. And secondly, this was also just a period of time where it was quite unstable. Empirically speaking, the Balkans went happy. Prague tried to have a revolution which got crushed in 1968. Those are the reasons as to why they had to double down and increase things like surveillance and increase things like repression. Number three, there was also an increase in the amount of arms spending which is happening here. Number one, I think the reason here is empirical, which is that proxy warfare happened. They invaded Afghanistan, Vietnam was happening, people wanted to battle, space race is also happening. The reasons for structurally speaking though are firstly, is to say the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Udai advised, demonstrated a hot war wasn't viable, which meant you need to spread your seeds wide and have more cold wars and proxy wars elsewhere. But secondly, it was a way to derive legitimacy when things were failing, which is that you can point to military successes elsewhere if your economy wasn't doing so well. And number three, I think it just was like you want to expand the control of communist areas so you can have more trading partners and you can have more friends, which means you're able to, have people who give you stuff which you can exploit, and that was going to increase your economy in ways which are good. What are the implications for the US in terms of observing the nature of the Soviet politic? I think the first thing to note here is these sort of policies tracking back to centralization and going back towards things like nationalization were economically damaging and were going to cause things like stagnation, which is bad for the economy for a few reasons. Number one, you get less innovation because you've got no incentive to work on that cool ways to do things because, at that point, you weren't actually going to be monetarily rewarded for that. Number two, I think production also decreases because the quotas often imposed were quite unreasonable. It means people often took shortcuts when they tried to produce things, or alternatively, people fudged a book so they didn't actually produce the output which was recorded on it. Number three, I think there also was no incentive for individual farmers or individual workers to generate the amount of benefit they wanted to for the reason that they weren't going to be rewarded for it, compared to under Khrushchev's era where if you did a good job, you would get a bonus, and that was going to incentivize people to be productive, incentivize people to work, and also probably kept them happier because it meant that the amount of effort they put into something was commensurate to the amount of money they were getting here. The impact of this is just that Soviet economy is going to get owned. Empirically speaking, this was the age of stagnation for the Soviet economy. It meant that the Soviet economy on the decline, you didn't really have to do anything, it'll probably buck itself over here. This is also the reason why Gorbachev who came after just liberalized everything afterwards, privatized things, because it was a silly idea. David.
The race of ideologies was obfuscated by the context of specific countries. I explained that only a blank slate and an equal playing field can best demonstrate the superiority of your system and accelerate the pace of your development.
So I just think like this could be super based, right? Because it's like you give them this kind of head start, and it's like having the perfect Civ 5 starting ground with all like resources and all the kind of like materials in this area. So yeah, and also the second thing to note here is that the problem with the USSR is kind of like it's really big and really, really hard to manage. If it's half of Spain you can play like SimCity here, you can get really good at organizing your central planning and things like that. No explanation as to why this is going to fail. It's simply asserted that capitalism will always win as opposed to communism. I think that even at the point where you believe there's a risk of it failing, that's cripplingly humiliating to the West, right? The very fact that communism can succeed if it was like a perfect little Stardew Valley commune where everyone was nice to each other, I just think it was not a risk worth taking. Secondly to note here is increased arms spending in this era also probably meant that it was totally unproductive amount of capital, which is not going to the people, not going to the economy, and that just meant that people's life in the USSR was likely to be quite bad and these are the reasons as to why people are likely to be unhappy and likely to dissent. How should you situate this extension within the context of spec? Firstly, OO's whole case here is speculative. I reckon they're on some pretty based impacts, but the problem here is that maybe conflict will occur, maybe like World War III is actually going to happen, etc. We explain to you why in this precise moment of time, the information you would have as a US leader is simply unstrategic and simply gobsmackingly stupid to do so, because it would probably indicate that the user would not survive in the near future. The second thing here is that this decision is likely to be quite permanent, right? Which is to say, once you give it, you can't take it back, so, I mean, it's just there the whole time, and even if the USSR does collapse eventually, they can just sell it off to China, I guess, and maybe that's still something which is quite bad, but you simply cannot reverse the decision, and the risk of them doing something bad with it afterwards is no good here. So the thing you have to believe at the end of the speech is the USSR might not count to the next 30 years, but this is the beginning of the end, and it is clear and evident. I do not know why you want to award them with some sort of advantage. My last observation to make here is, like, look, this is a pretty underexplored, I don't really know what's there. What if they, like, drill it and find rare earth minerals, and then you're fucked? So, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I now welcome the government whip, ANU's second finest, Tom Daddy Erectus Frankham.
I'm going to be as generous as Kat as she was to our argument. I think this is a lovely history lesson with almost no actual argument in Kat's speech. I learned things, I had fun, and still you somehow got fall. Right? Let's be clear. What do they prove in this argument? There is stagnation in the Soviet Russia, which Olo explains to you, right? And she just says a bunch of Russian names that are presumably real people. Maybe they're not. I think Olo's explanation that they're running out of wheat and there's starvation is probably sufficient in this debate. The next claim they make is you could try things in your half of Spain. You could try things in Turkmenistan as well. It would go just as well, and it's unclear why you need to use the Pacific Islands rather than something you already own. Finally, they say that this is the turning point of Soviet Russia, despite the fact it is 35 years before it fails. So it's unclear why there's not 20 more failing points that might have occurred before. I'll finally, before I get into our arguments, deal with the one response we get from Kat, which is, well, actually it's God, and there makes no arguments around this. Connor gave me 2 reasons why God probably really hates the US right now, and there's actually nothing you can do to deal with God's wrath except fight against God. 2 reasons. First, God is clearly Catholic, and the US is currently Protestant at the moment. God would totally like to fuck you over with this argument. Second, the US has recently implemented no-fault divorce, which is incredibly un-Catholic. God would definitely want to fuck you over. I don't think, on the fact of those 2 factors, it particularly cares that you decided to have a chat to some atheists and give it a bit of land. Probably already hates you. You probably need to fight God rather than make friends with him at this point. Obviously, that's not your preference, but you're probably totally fucked if it's God. They make no reason to explain why it actually is. Let's talk about what this McIsland is and why it is in fact a super secret, huge, and really, really fucking scary spacecraft. The first thing is obviously this area is incredibly well explored, both by US intelligence and Navy, and both by shipping that occurs between the US and Japan primarily at this moment. This island must have arrived incredibly quickly. Otherwise, if it was something like a coral atoll or as tectonic plates pushing up, we would start to see very small parts of that island, and then we would see more of that island, and then more of it. Instead, we discovered all of fucking Spain in the middle of ocean. So this must have arrived incredibly quickly. The second problem is, this could not be something like a volcano eruption or an asteroid landing on Earth, because the tectonic testing pins you already have in something like San Francisco that's incredibly prone to earthquakes because it's also on the Bay of Fire. would have picked up the fact that these things happened. I think Connor explains an asteroid probably would have killed us all anyway. So there needed to be some amount of controlled landing for this to not be picked up. It is only possible if that was done by like incredibly advanced ion thrusters or something like that. You landed this thing like it was a feather landing on this table, and it was the size of fucking Spain. So trust me, this technology is like uber advanced and far, far better than either the US or the USSR is capable in the end of the 60s. And I think that means this is an incredible threat, at least perceived, even if these people were peaceful, an incredible threat to these countries at all. The final thing I want to note here is that this spacecraft, despite probably landing yesterday, has managed to coat itself in camo, probably like with like, I don't know, like some light show or something like that. It's incredibly advanced and none of us can understand. It replicates like dirt and trees and all those other things that we think lives on this island for it to appear fertile. I think this again demonstrates the incredible technical capacity of this island. Let's go.
It would be regrettable for a few Americans to die on this alien spacecraft, but surely it would be very worthwhile at least to have exclusive and first knowledge of aliens. If nothing else, this gives Americans the chance to reconvert back to Catholicism before they're all wiped out.
I love that. I think the distinct problem here is this is not a couple of like soldiers dying, right? Like obviously we agree, we don't care about a couple of soldiers. If this spacecraft can do this, and it is this large, and there's that many aliens on it, like the whole world's fucked, right? Like we need to have every piece of our military capacity to deal with this. We'll impact this a little bit later. Let's quickly then talk about why aliens exist. We explained that this carbon-based life form is likely to exist somewhere in the enormity of the galaxy, and the Earth and our current solar system is not particularly close to the Big Bang or anything like that, which means there's a series of universes that are far, far older than we are, and far, far more technically advanced than we are. That means they probably exist. That is probably why they have spaceships the size of Spain and they're able to land like a feather, and why they're able to do these things and probably have incredibly technically capable weapons. Let's then explain why we would rather not let the journalists reveal this and the Soviet Union find out this way. I want to note, no other team in this debate deals with this part of the info slide, so credit to us at least for like revealing the fact that we might talk about some of the other things, as opposed to just like assuming something magical happened and it's very good and we shouldn't question lovely gifts from God like every other team in this debate. What do we explain? First, is the USSR finding out via journalists in this is likely to be incredibly skeptical of just why you didn't tell them in the first place. As Connor already points out, there is a relationship that is developing with the Russians that aliens is something you're likely to work together on, and they will be skeptical and pushed back on the fact that you did not uphold that part of the conversation that is beginning to have. Second, if you give it to them too late or they take some part of it by force because they think it is valuable or because they think it is an alien craft, they will think you have tampered with it, and hence they do not trust the evidence if you do not give it to them firsthand and quickly as possible. It is only when they are also capable of independently determining what this is, and it is not something from Earth, it is alien and a threat, are they willing to do the things that you are going to do to militarize and be able to protect yourself in those contexts. I'm not going to take the POI, guys. So it is only under this situation that they're able to have this conversation. To be generous to the op bench, they claim that, well, maybe you'll be a little skeptical of this because it's unclear you're giving a gift. I think OG has some response to this. I want to point out here, it's probably just something you say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I think it might be aliens. They're probably going to trust you in that sense because you've had that set of conversations already, and it's something that you are becoming more comfortable with. Your diplomatic ties are getting better, even if they're not overtly getting better. Let's talk about why you actually do need the Soviet help to deal with aliens in this craft. First characterization of this is these truly are terrible aliens that want to kill all of us, maybe because we're heathens and they are sent from God, but it doesn't really matter, they're here to kill us all. Why do we need them here? This spacecraft the size of Spain, all those aliens, all those things, we probably need every piece of military tech we can, we probably need every nuclear weapon we can. I think this plays exactly into all those problems here. They're like, oh, you militarize and nuclearize the island. Fucking hell, we need those things to fight off aliens, and it's only this way that we're able to generate that benefit if they do it incredibly quickly here. I want to note, if this is a world where you come and invade the island, or because the US doesn't get control of it quickly or something like that, they will not be able to put these things in quickly enough. They'll be scared that the US will be able to overrun their basic military encampments. But if you say that half that island is yours, they trust that the whole island is safe and they can build those encampments first before protecting the nuclear sites. I think this means we actually have a chance at surviving against the the alien threat that occurs in this situation. And frankly, the US interest here is simple. It hates the US, but it likes living a far bit more. Obviously, we need to be able to defend ourselves either against God or aliens. Very proud of those.
Thank thank you very much for that geographic lesson on the Bay of Fire.
It's better than everyone else in Jordan.
I now welcome Ellie, Swar, many words written, Stephenson.
When someone hands you a large, juicy, and unexplained McIsland, there are indeed many questions, but regardless of the answers, you should not hand it to your largest earthly existential threat. Because if the answers to those questions are terrible, you should not grant them the capacity to get that information and fuck you over with it. And if the answers to those questions are great, then why the fuck would you give it away? Regardless, the answer is definitely not create a joint nuclear extermination event, as claimed by CG. I'm going to do 3 things in this debate. Firstly, will the ocean Godzilla or whatever it is eat us, responding to CG. Secondly, why McIsland can't defeat communism, responding to OG. And then finally, why does our context get us up over a lot? Alright, will the ocean Godzilla eat us? The first thing I want to note is that the info slide doesn't actually say that there was no big noise and seismic activity that was noted. Maybe the reason you discovered it is there was a big bang and then you drove the ship over and you were like, oh, there's an island now. If that's true, they can't win. But engaging charitably, let's say it is the aliens. A few things. One, giving the USSR an alien island is perceived as even more of a trap as just giving them a normal island. If I'm the USSR and I give you this giant, unexplained, light show island, they literally just say no. Why? It is just not explained why they respond to this constructively. Secondly, it is not explained why you fight aliens better with the USSR, except that they have even more nukes, which is crazy. 1, you can probably work with the UK or whatever. 2, you have a lot of nukes yourself. 3, just nuking this spaceship is probably a bad thing. 4, of any state in the world with whom to work to fight aliens, the USSR is probably the worst candidate because you have fundamental ideological disagreements. Other proxy wars going on in other places, this probably fragments your anti-alien defense force. It's probably really bad. Secondly, by the logic of opening government, capitalism is an immensely efficient and logical system. So I would posit that the aliens are an extremely advanced life form that can do cool terraforming, which means they probably agree with you and want you to beat the USSR, which is why they put an island on your doorstep. So don't refuse their gift, I guess. The aliens are definitely capitalist, but also, if they're not friendly, we should gain an advantage. How do we know that the USSR doesn't form an alliance with the aliens and wipe us out? Just not worth the risk. We should at least investigate them. The final thing I want to note is that almost all of their analysis is we should tell the USSR about it? Yeah, sure, but don't give them half of it. I think it's probably the case. The final thing I want to say is that, there is a chance that this is God that has just blessed you with an island. We think that OG provides relatively persuasive reasons why God might be a big fan of capitalism and America, and might just give you an island, at which point rejecting a blessing from God is probably very unwise. They're oh, they're not Catholic. Well, you know who's also not Catholic? The USSR. Alright, so I think at the end of this, it's highly unlikely that this isn't just the result of an earthquake. But even if it's aliens, they probably like the US, and even if they don't like the US, it's just not proven to me at any point in that CG case why you should work with the USSR to fight them. Alright, why can't McIsland defeat communism? There are several steps of quite diluted things you would need to believe that McIsland could defeat communism. 1, you have to believe that the USSR fights the McIsland arms race fairly. What I would do if I was the USSR is just not do anything, and then the US would have to gradually ramp up their presence on the island, and you'd just be I keep doing it, I guess. They're just not compelled to partake, and when they are, they can just do little pranks on you, they can poison your crops, they can knock things down here and there. It's just not clear that they treat this the little side-by-side comparison you think it is. Secondly, you would need to then believe that winning this was persuasive. Note that the USSR has massive propaganda mechanisms. Note that the failure of communism is usually an experiential thing, where people personally experience suffering. That is far more persuasive to them than an island going badly. Thirdly, and most importantly, this is called the McIsland experiment. Whoever rebelled against their government because of McIsland. Thirdly, they have to prove that you would actually win. And note that Russia has conducted an immense industrial acceleration recently. They can probably like build things. Secondly, Russia is pretty good at planning, but really sucks when it comes to large scale and dealing with like a lot of different states combined into one. There's not an issue here. Thirdly, it's just unpredictable. Like they might just find some rare earth minerals and do really well. The framing here is just like not worth the risk, given the like symbolism as explained by OG. Fourthly, you would have to believe that winning is good. They do not tell you why the USSR would respond to this humiliation well. They do not explain why they would not use this land as a bargaining chip or sell it to someone like China. Also, putting resources into ramping up this island arms race, which you would have to do by Udai's logic, is probably bad for you too, and you should probably just focus on really conclusively winning the space race. So overall, it is not clear that the Mikhailid experiment actually happens, not clear that it actually works, and not clear that if you won, it would be a good thing. I think that's OG out. I'll take you now.
Sure. They would have to participate for the same reason they had to participate in the space race, Star Wars, or gaining influence with third world countries. The audience is those countries, not people in the Soviet Union who would obviously get those benefits.
Yeah, so there's actually a big difference between the space race and McIsland. One, the name. Two, I think in the case of the space race, like the framing is like you're creating incredible pieces of technology that take humans to like new heights, that give you control over like areas of orbit, that put satellites into space that help with spying and shit like that. Is clearly more instrumentally useful than like someone being like, here's an island. And like also they can humiliate you far better by being like, no, I don't want the island, don't care, just a little island, we can win ideologically anyway. So very different, not at all comparable, just focus on really winning the space race, which actually matters. Finally then, why does our context get us up over OO? I think there are two reasons why really thinking about why it is likely that the US knows that the USSR is under threat, it is weaker than you are, and that you can win without doing this shit is really important. One, because it engages charitably with the idea that this island, that this island experiment might go really well, like maybe you do just win and it's kind of humiliating, but it explains why, you just don't need that. This is a waste of resources and you ought to focus on what you're already doing, the track you're already on. But secondly, I think it comes up above the quite marginal opening half clashes about like where the nuclear subs are or like the speed of public image changes. Those things are pretty marginal, they are hard to adjudicate, but understanding the context is the crucial reason why there's not a 50-50 choice. You should not take this risk because you're already on a good track. So handing them rare earth minerals or something is something which could be really, really harmful. It could change the track that you're currently on. You ought not to take that risk because of the unique context that we give you at CG. It is sad, I think, that Tom is a bad history student because all of those things were clearly explained to you and received very little response whatsoever, which is why that context is so determinative in explaining why this risk is quite frankly not worth taking. So proud to Udai.
Go upstairs.